I was told to start after the ding. I think we all heard the ding, right? Okay, well, you may be wondering why I gathered you all here today. I'm Dr. John LaPook. I'm the chief medical correspondent for CBS News, so I do 60 Minutes on Sunday morning, evening news in the morning. I'm also a professor of medicine at NYU Langone Health. The reason why I'm standing up here is because I started something, came over to NYU in 2013 to start the Empathy Project, which focuses initially actually on creating Hollywood quality short films and other materials to train and teach clinicians in training and other people to be more empathic and sensitive and competent, and then very importantly to empower patients to demand it. Fade out, fade in. We now have a Center for Empathy in Medicine. We're studying empathy. We've done lots of stuff. I would encourage you to go to our website, empathyproject.com, not empathy.com, but empathyproject.com, and to get a little amuse-bouche of what we do in terms of the Hollywood quality. Scroll down a little, you'll see an animated video, 6 minutes long, called The Elephant in the Waiting Room, about implicit bias, and little teaser with the voice. Yes, the voice of Denise the Empathy Elephant is in fact Whoopi Goldberg. So there's lots of fun stuff there, and I think it'll give you a taste. We're going to give you a slice of what we do today with talking about our empathy boot camp. And I'm going to leave it at that and turn it over to Ellen and Jen, Dr. Jen Adams, who's the head of the Center for Empathy in Medicine. And then I'm going to be in the audience. So take it away. Introduce yourselves and
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Ellen Tepfer. I'm the manager of teaching strategies at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And my role there is to develop different pedagogical strategies and engagements for different kinds of visitors. And with findings from neurology to cardiology about the health benefits of engagement with art, I started to explore some programs for our audiences that would leverage those benefits, including some partnerships with health organizations, and one of which was the Empathy Project at NYU. We met, I guess, by good fortune and accident, but it was a match that ended up being very productive for both of us and has really helped us expand those health offerings. And if you want to introduce yourself also, Jen?
I'm Jen Adams. I am the director of the Frankfurt Center for Empathy in Medicine at NYU Langone Health. I also am a primary care doctor at an FQHC at Health and Hospitals, which is one of our city clinics, and I run the primary care residency training track at NYU in Bellevue. So I've had a long career of medical education and service for New York City patients. For years, I've taught communication. And we've studied communication, and we think about how do we teach young doctors to be the doctors that you want to go to, right? That's the goal here. A couple of years ago, John was wise enough to start an empathy project, and I was lucky enough to get hired to really start thinking about the academics of empathy. And what is empathy? And can we study it? And can we teach it? And does it make a difference? Let me start by saying it is clearly documented. I am not doing a journal club here. I'm not going to present data. I could come back and do that if you'd like me to, or I can talk after. But empathies have been shown in the medical arena. Patients have better outcomes, physicians have less burnout, and patients are more satisfied. If there was a pill that I could give anybody to take that, we would all take it, right? Those are great outcomes, and they're really well studied. In the non-medical arena, if you look across the globe in some of the more business-focused arenas, it has been shown that empathetic leadership improves longevity at jobs, productivity, and employee satisfaction and joy at their job. So again, good data that this matters. But the question remains, what is empathy? So let's start by asking you all, anybody, what's empathy? If this will only work if we all talk together today. We're small groups, so what's empathy? Go.
Appreciating how someone else is feeling.
I love that. Anybody want to go further?
Putting yourself in someone else's shoes.
Great, and that was what I used to say too, and we're going to talk about that. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Other ideas? Listening. Thinking about the other person. Others? I'll do one more.
Mirror neurons.
I love that, yes. And actually, there is a great deal of research going on the neuroscience of empathy, which is exciting. So we at the Empathy Project have come up with this definition. It's the practice of authentically trying to understand another person's lived experience through communication and, more specifically, through engaged curiosity. And this took us a long time to come up with this definition, and it takes everything you all said into account. So in terms of living another's experience, we're trying to think about how we can understand their experience. If you go to the next slide, we've also developed 4 components of empathy. 1, being engaged curiosity. 2, active listening. 3, perspective believing, and I want to give Christina Gonzalez from NYU credit for that term. I really love it. It's talking about believing another's perspective, not taking it or giving it, but just understanding that others' perspectives are valid. And then self-awareness. And when we think about this, the question is, how do we study it? And again, we're not going to go through the data, but everything we do, we're studying. And we have a research group that's actually looking at these components so that if you want to bring empathy training to your world, we can actually tell you what the components are and how do you evaluate them. And that's something we're working very hard at. So for today, our goal, or that you all have a wonderful time, and that maybe you can take some of this back with you to your home institutions, your programs, and your communities. Just to say, we have done this workshop that we're going to do with you with medical students, faculty, residents, staff. We took our entire research team, and we took our comms and marketing team. So we've done this broadly, and we did it at South by Southwest for young educators. So we're finding that this workshop is applicable in so many ways, so we're really happy you're here. But so today, we hope you're going to develop foundational skills to use art to enhance empathy within your world, whatever you define that as, embrace the different roles of observation and interpretation, and really appreciate the intellectual flexibility that requires of each one of you. It's actually hard work to do this. It's not simple. But when I say it's hard work, what that means is it's teachable. Teachable. Value engaged curiosity and the courage to change one's viewpoint, and recognize diverse viewpoints and multi-interpretation lead to deeper seeing and understanding. And I think that's why empathetic leadership actually results in such wonderful outcomes in multiple areas. I'm going to pass it back to my friend, and I'll be back in a little bit.
So instead of just telling you about our work, we're going to actually do a little bit of an empathy boot camp workshop today, and we're going to actually look at a work of art. So we don't have the painting here with us, but we have a slide of it. And I'd like to ask each table to be a little working group when we ask for discussion in a couple of minutes. If you're at a smaller table or a larger table, they both could work, but you could also just join up with each other when we start that portion. But I want to also ask if we could have our volunteers, and thank you very, very much for that, to come up on stage and be our model group as we have each of you be a group at your table. So please come up and take a seat. And if you could each just briefly, with the mic, just introduce yourselves very briefly to us all so we know who we're talking to.
Hi, my name is Jenny, and I'm here from LA, and I actually work at the cross-section of neuroscience and art therapy.
Oh, we have a ringer. Mike?
My name is Becca Barish. I'm also in LA, and I am a social worker and an improviser, so also work at the cross-section.
Wonderful, we found the right people. Okay.
My name is Catherine Fry. I live here full-time year-round. I moved here in the 90s. I actually am in the HR space, so I'm bringing neuroscience and thought intelligence to my industry.
Great.
And I'm Bob Henderson. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I am in the faith field and in the church world, and Presbyterian minister there.
Wonderful. Thank you all, and thank you for volunteering, and it's great to have you here. So I want to start by just taking some time to look closely at the painting. We're just going to call it a painting and pretend. So I'm going to time it for a minute. Actually going to ask my colleague to time it because I left my phone over there. When we go to museums, typically on average spend way less than even 30 seconds looking at a painting. Most of paintings we just walk by, and if we stop for less than 30 seconds. So even just taking a minute is an exercise that's a little different from what we might normally be used to. So everyone in the audience with us today is looking at the big screen to my left, and you all can see the painting in front of you here. And just take that 1 minute, if you would, to look closely at all the details that you see in the picture.
And those in the back, feel free to get closer if you see it.
Thank you for saying that.
There's a glare too.
Just take this table. Just make yourselves comfortable.
None of these things should be empty over here. Why are you back there?
Okay, that was just 30 seconds, but as you continue with the next 30 seconds, even those of you, maybe if you haven't moved already, you could think about moving, even just standing up if you're comfortable doing that, or sitting down if you're standing, or just visually. Look at the edges of the painting. Look for the details, maybe not the first thing you saw. Look into the shadows, and look at some details that you might have previously missed. 30 seconds again.
It is so much better.
Up on stage, you could also, if you want to. This is closer to the size of the painting.
This is like the group we have at the Whitney.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. You can move your bodies as you wish, but I'll continue with the group on stage. So if any of the volunteers here want to be our working model group, and you can all just consider amongst yourselves for the moment inside your minds, but what is something, whoever wants to start, that stood out to you or that you noticed in the painting?
For me, I do a lot of coaching of women, so of course the women in the foreground really pop out to me. From a historical perspective, obviously, we're in a different day and age today, so that's just really coming across for me. Chicago, of course. My brother's in Chicago, so this looks very much like Chicago to me. What happens at night, the difference between night and day. I also no longer drink alcohol, so for me, it looks like a joyous occasion was had. So I don't even know if that's what I should be describing, but that's honestly what came out to me.
So, Deborah, was it?
Catherine.
I'm sorry. Catherine, so you're noticing the women, and I'm just going to gesture to the larger painting here. You're going to notice these women that are sort of running forward and gesturing one behind them to the other woman who's standing there.
Yes.
Also, there's a group to the left,
Yes.
which is a sort of group of women that are embracing
Yes.
arm to arm.
Yes.
And you described them as joyous. Can you just tell me a little bit more details about what made you think of?
It looks like there's laughter. They're having a great time. I also believe these are two police officers. Maybe they're in a little bit of trouble from their joyous evening. I can't really tell.
Are
I
you
even have
noticing
my
the gentleman
glasses
in the
on.
car or off to the
Yes.
left walking on
The gentleman in the car. The two gentlemen in the car.
Can you say a little bit about what makes you think they're police officers?
Their attire? I believe I'm seeing hats. I believe I'm seeing matching tan, perhaps uniforms. But that was my interpretation.
So the fellows in the car are wearing some kind of uniform. You're describing the gesture, bodily, physical gestures of the women and their facial expressions as joyous. Does anyone see something different or something that they want to add to that?
When I look at this, I look at people who are in different stages of an experience. And so I see the front women going off, having a good time, kind of asking the other woman to come along. The two men in the car, not so sure about it. The two men off to the left, very much not so sure about it. The other person, potentially a person experiencing homelessness. There's a paper there. And then two women saying goodbye, so there's just this kind of panoply of staging
If I could ask you just to describe a little bit more about some of the things that you said. What are you just seeing as kind of women that are saying goodbye? What makes you think that that's what's happening?
Well, it looks to me that the woman in the orange and the color is a subjective term. My wife reminds me regularly, and so the two women over on the right that are in some kind of embrace, woman one arm in arm, one with a hand on her back. So that seems like a some are going, some are leaving, some are joining, some
So
are.
perhaps the woman in orange, as she turns her head behind, is a gesture of goodbye.
Right, a gesture of goodbye, and the woman in the yellow is potentially hugging the woman goodbye. Looks to me like the men on the left are kind of, they're going off somewhere, not sure we're a part of this or want to be a part of this.
So can you say a little bit more about like what visually you see about the men? He's looking here at the two men walking along the sidewalk on the left. What makes you think that what are you trying to describe? They're not so sure about what's happening with the women, or you're not so sure of their mood. What is it about the way that they're painted or their physical demeanor that makes you think
Heads
that?
are down, non-expression or flat expression, a little bit of a distance. So.
If I can summarize, and you tell me if I'm getting it right, they just seem to have a very different physical demeanor than the gestures that the women are making, and it separates them in some kind of way that you're not yet identifying. Okay.
I think I should talk about this in therapy this week because I had different perspective than the other two. But also I'll say that my feeling changed when you asked us to look more closely. My first thought when I looked at it was, why are those two men driving in that direction toward the sidewalk and those women are in front of the vehicle? And so originally it was almost like these three women trying to run and saying to their friend like, what is going on, and then the two men on the sidewalk doing nothing to help the situation. And the other people on the right just having a nice time and just like, where are you kind of at depending on your night and what you have to deal with. And to go to the gender piece, a little bit of like women just trying to have fun, but then a man just comes and tries to drive his car into on the side of the road. But then when I looked more closely, the faces didn't look so, it was hard for me to fully get the faces, but when looking up like why she'd be holding her hand out, I feel like she wouldn't be holding her hand out to say like, come with us in front of the car. So that made me sort of change to think maybe it's not as dark as I originally thought.
So it's interesting that what you're noticing in your interpretation of their gestures is the women in the group on the left may be having a different experience than the group of women on the right, specifically in relationship to the car. Yeah. So are they moving and their leg out behind them and this kind of gestures as a gesture of joy and some of the other things that we talked about, or are they sort of diving for their lives as the car approaches them? Two very different interpretations that you can describe. And then we have this woman, the one reaching out you mentioned, but who's she reaching out to? That woman, is she giggling with her hand like that, or is she screaming in her? So it is a lot of sort of different activities going on, and it's a very, I think, useful exercise, if I want to just reflect back on what you're saying, to think about how we really see these different gestures, movements, the sort of straight up and downness of the men on the left, and the much more moving and turning and twisting and leaping of the women that could be joyous, that could be something else going on. But we want to start with just looking at all those details. I know that your name again? Bob. Sorry, Bob. You also mentioned the sort of figures in the shadows on the left here, and we'll return to those in a moment, but I want to give our last participant, Jenny, a chance to share some observations.
Yeah, I have a completely different.
You're going to therapy.
I think we should all.
We're all going to therapy this week.
So when my first drawing was the three women and then the car, the green car. I'm thinking there's a lot of release of energy in this scene. I don't know where these women are coming from. It looks like the three are going towards the fun, where it's probably at the end of the week, a lot of stress built up, and they're ready to, unleash and have some fun. And the orangey group just had some fun, maybe continuing on. And I think the red car is driving towards the happiness. They're like, what are those women having? I'm gonna have some of myself.
See if we can join them.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
And then the two gentlemen there are, uptight in their uptight suit, but are very entertained.
So you're noticing not only the physical body position of the gentleman on the left, and you mentioned their facial expressions, but you're also adding that they have suits and the outfits that they're wearing. You're including into your description there. So I want to just sort of return, and I'm going to pass the mic to Jen in a moment, but also just to point out the difference between observation and interpretation, and how difficult it is to separate those two. When we see somebody running with joy, we see the running with joy all together, and to sort of break that up and think, what am I actually seeing here? And then next, after a moment, we're going to talk about how we can build on that interpretation from what we're seeing. But Jen, if you want to.
So I have to come over here, or I'm going to hit you. It's the only way it's going to work here. All right. So what is the first thing you think we do when we teach medical students? When you walk into your doctor's room, what do? They smile. But what's the doctor doing? They're observing, right? What happens frequently? What do they run to? Yes, they do. I do. But they run to interpretation, right? They automatically start interpreting. So when we teach medical students, we want to break that. We want to say the first thing you need to do is observe. And what a beautiful example you gave us today. 4 people observe things entirely different. This is no different than when a patient walks into our rooms. So when we teach this, we start talking about observation and the importance of that key skill. We all have biases. We all have different experiences that make us observe things differently. By teaching medical students on day 1 that you must observe before you start interpreting, because the patient deserves that, you're starting the foundation of empathy. I always talk about when you see an obstetrician, a woman walks in with like this, the first thing an obstetrician thinks is ovarian torsion or missed abortion, or they're going to deliver, depending on what they observe. In internists, what's the first thing they think of when somebody's clutching their belly like this? Anybody know? Appendicitis, right? I mean, that's what we go to. So again, that's where our observation skills are developed, and teaching med students on day 1 the importance of observing before interpretation really changes the type of physician they become. In the workplace, we talk about it a lot. Your coworker is always on time, comes in with their lunch pack all made, their water bottle, their hair's up in a nice bow. Week later, they come in, they're late, they don't have their lunch, they're disheveled. That's observation. Something's going on with that coworker. And if you observe how that increases the workplace dynamic is one of the core skills of empathy and thinking. I'm going to pass it back to go to the next part. Sorry to walk across you.
So I want to think more about interpretation now. Of course, we had a lot of those immediate impulses and those immediate ideas that we start with, but I want to start to build an interpretation. What's the story of what's going on? We've had a lot of starts, a lot of ideas, and I'm sure as I asked you all to think of that in your minds, you've had 2. If we could just take 3 minutes and turn toward your groups at the table. 2 people is fine, but if you want to join up with these 2 people, you can make it 4 people. Here's a 2-person table. You can come over, and we can make the little groups. So please turn toward each other, and I'll ask you to do the same and have a conversation on stage about what is the story that's going on here. You don't have to reach a consensus, but just discuss with each other what influenced you, what do you think the story is of what's going on in this painting. I'll just give it 3 minutes, please.
Some are getting off the train late, and some are trying to make the train or something. I also think there's that possibility. Geography doesn't seem to make sense that way, but it's an idea.
I was thinking about this group on the right and how their arms are all around each other. And that to me feels just what it's like to be with friends and enjoying gatherings and things like that. So I got a sense of real enjoyment of this side and the one on the right that's turned to be
in the gorilla suit. Could be a narrative, yeah.
Somebody
Okay, we're not quite at 3 minutes, but wrap up. See if you can come up with some stories just to finish up.
In my mind, it's like, let's keep the party going. She's like,
Okay, okay, thank you very much. When we do this in the museum, we pull our stools aside into small groups, and the idea is to explore intersubjective meaning making. We don't usually come up with meanings in isolation. Even Jen's example, your previous context, your previous knowledge will lead toward some of it, and also as we learn together, discuss with other people, we develop meanings in that kind of intersubjective way. So we do these small groups, and then we come back and share. So if any of you would just like to briefly describe maybe some of the stories or some of the narrative or ideas of what's going on in the painting from the group, we have a couple of people with mics that could come over if we have any volunteers to share what their table discussed. Thank you very much.
So we had some interesting theories about placement where this was taking place. Chicago was a viable possibility. Paris was another possibility. But the general consensus we came up with, and two of us actually had this in mind after our observations, was that this was a celebration after World War I, given the wardrobe and the style of the car and the trolleys, the possibility that the purple in the back behind the clock tower were fireworks. So those were our observations, generally speaking.
So really interesting that you came up with a story that had much more to do with time and place and historical context rather than the relationships of the figures in the front. So thank you for sharing that with me. Thank you very much, Jen.
So we had different perspectives at our table, but I'll say the one distinguishing feature that was really interesting was two of us focused on the people in the forefront and the kind of building the story around, I kind of coined it as ladies' night out, and others at our table focused more on the infrastructure in the background. So the lamppost and the storefronts and the train at the top. So it was an interesting kind of juxtapositioning to build the story on, but we also felt it was some sort of celebration. We talked about it being during Prohibition and the women kind of maybe being up to no good and doing things perhaps that they weren't supposed to be doing. And then we debated a lot about actually whether the car was driving or parked. And we had mixed views at our table as to whether or not that was the case. So it was interesting, 4 different perspectives.
So I want to thank you very much for sharing. I want to reflect back to the larger group that although they did talk a bit about the story of what's going on with the figures in the foreground, as our group on stage focused on, they also added in not exactly the same as time and place and historical context, but they were looking at what is the kind of architecture or infrastructural details of modernity that the artist might be looking at here, of trains and buses and trolleys and cars and walking and people, and in the back there's more cars going, and looking at the city and how the artist is representing the city of its times and what that might mean for how the people are relating to each other, including ladies' night out or prohibition or this kind of thing. So thank you for sharing that. If we just have one more before we turn to our volunteers on stage. Thank you very much.
We were, I guess, a little bit different, thinking it's at dusk and kind of after work. And the women are all very, very active. The two men in the background might be just strolling home. They seem older, and everybody else in the front seems younger. And an interrupted celebration makes sense because the women on the right do seem to be embracing, and after 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, and a few drinks, that could be that scene. But the women on the left with the car, I think, kind of agreed that that was a little bit tense situation, and that maybe they were trying to lure the women into the car, the ones close to the car, or the woman was trying to convince the men not to drive into the other women, and the one woman was kind of confronting him. So we found that a little more tension than celebration in that part. The other thing that we observed was that it's got to be kind of a noisy environment. It's dusk, the train's right over your head, there's another train behind, as you said, there's a trolley coming down the street, that old car can't be quiet, and the women are not being quiet. So the only quiet part is really the two older men sauntering down the street in front of the church. It just so it seems like an unusual juxtaposition that they're observing this and they're not really part of the rest of the thing that's going on. They've come upon it.
Thank you for sharing. So there's a lot going on at that table. That was a busy table. But one of the things that I want to point to here is a little bit more investing in inquiry into the gender dynamics in the historical context. They're both looking at the historical context, but thinking about the gender dynamics. Are the women depicted here as more free and more kind of embracing the freedom of modernity, and the men are a little bit left behind, both in the car, strapped in, and walking along in their suits? And so we have very different kind of gender dynamic, which may be, on the one hand, celebratory, and on the other hand, as an artist might be reflecting on modernity of his times, it's also a little threatening. Their women are out there in the world. They're not under the protection of their classical traditions, and they're out there, and are the men threatening? Are they left behind? We have a lot of open questions, but we do have this question of the gender dynamics, the historical context, the urban infrastructure and architecture, and we have the sort of play or drama of the figures in the front. But I want to also turn to you all if you want to continue with the drama of the figures in the front, or any other topic that you came up with in your conversation. I'd love for you to share.
I think we have one title. Let's keep the party going.
So you're focusing on the party aspect of the women. You're sticking with your party aspect. Okay. Anyone else want to share, like, what stories you came up with, what you talked about in your conversations? No pressure.
Bob is convinced they're not going to church. That's for sure.
Instead of interpreting what they're doing, he stuck with what they're not doing. Felt confident about that one. Felt confident about that one. We had a lot of sharing from the audience, which I very much appreciate. If you're feeling a bit shy up here, I just want to give you one more encouragement, that they all shared very different perspectives. And it's not for you to think, oh, well, I see they're saying that, so we must have been wrong. There isn't a wrong here, so I'll give you one more encouragement to share on that basis. Otherwise, I will let you be.
Well, it's really not about, it's more about what's going on in my brain. I want to know the right answer, and I find that really fascinating. I'm sitting here, am I right, am I wrong? So it's a little bit of self-judgment going on, which I think is interesting for my own brain.
Yeah, and I think we were also talking about context clues, so thinking things like, okay, the train is still running, so what time of night would it potentially be if the trains are still going? Or someone was talking about the purple maybe seeming that the sun had just gone down, whereas for me, I saw it as way later. Even to actually speak to this table, when you said coming from church, it didn't even process in my mind that that was a church, but that's probably also when we're speaking about, like, I was like, it's a synagogue, but like, it's like also the different places that we come from. But I appreciate what you were saying about sometimes when people would share different things, we'd almost have that feeling of, is it wrong or is it different? Because if it was different, sometimes our instinct would be, no, it's got to be this, versus, oh no, we don't have the information. We're just trying to work with what we have here.
So I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think you gave some really interesting insights, really important insights, and moved on past interpretation to self-reflection and really thinking about why is it that I thought that thing that I thought? And so that kind of meta-reflection is a really important stage, and thinking it's more about what's going inside my head than what's going on in the painting. I'd love to return to that idea of meta-reflection and feed into that a little bit more, but I want to give Jen a chance to talk about interpretation first, and then we'll move on to that meta-reflection.
I'm sorry for crossing over. Okay, so if I went to a group of medical students and I'm going to say, well, you have to have perspective when you see patients, they'd be like, all right, whatever. They wouldn't even understand what that meant. You know, and I think if you ask anybody, what does it mean to believe somebody's perspective? It's so hard to teach that. But what did we see today? We all looked at a painting. The painting's in Paris. The painting's in Chicago. They're celebrating. They're running from danger. Everybody saw this painting differently. That is no different than what happens when you hear a patient's history. We hear things differently. It's based on our biases. And bias not being a negative thing. Bias is our lived experience. We all have bias. It's how we've seen other patients who present this way, how we hear different cultures present their set of disease. And so to be able to start teaching physicians about the importance of understanding others' perspectives and hearing them, and they're valid. Every one of yours interpretation of that painting is valid. It is the way you see it. And so what we found, if you all remember the 4 skills that engage curiosity, that perspective believing, the self-awareness, and active listening, that's what you all just did. Mm-hmm. And whoever said you want to get it right, bless you. It's like you're a plant. Because that's what we all want, right? We want the right answer. But how do we get to that right answer? Is through what you all just did. We had another painting where we looked at a Homer painting. And there's a man, he's rowing a boat, and there's a big boat in the distance. And I did this with students. And one kid's like, Hemingway, Cuba. Another student's like, it's the Mediterranean. When we got to the group together, it turned out one of the kids was an English major and had studied Hemingway and knew all about, you know, the photographs. One kid grew up on the sea, and it looked just like his home. And they were both valid. And I think to start that as a ground of acknowledgement that other views are valid and you need to listen and understand them and have that curiosity fundamentally changes the way our students our students, our doctors, our residents, our attendings start thinking about caring for patients. We had a group from the research community come. And what they were saying was that what this taught them was to think about research questions differently, which I just loved, because in listening to each other, they started to think differently. So it's not just for doctors. We've really found in a lot of arenas, this skill has been very valuable for hearing others' views and thinking about the importance of getting to a deeper level with whichever group you're in. I'm going to pass it back, and then I'll be back.
So thank you very much. I want to follow on some of the self-reflection that has started already, and thinking about, and you all to yourselves, think about why is it that I thought of the thing first that I thought? What was my, as Jen said, lived experience that brought me to think more about the historical context, or more about the architecture and infrastructure, or transportation and modernity, or more about the gender dynamics, and so on, more about the imagined narrative. And I'd like you to think, for interest of time, I'm going to skip over a little bit, but think in yourselves, I think we saw it demonstrated up here actually, did hearing the others' perspectives change how you thought of it? Update your thinking, oh yeah, maybe it's that. Maybe to the point of you didn't even want to talk anymore after you heard the other people's perspectives. But so think a little about that. I'll also share a little bit of information about the painting. And when you learn new facts, does that change? Think in your minds, does that change how you see the painting now? So some of you are talking about the historical context. I'll tell you the painting was made in 1928. So it is certainly during Prohibition. It's a little later than celebrating World War I. It puts us into this frame of when an artist may be considering what is modernity? What are gender roles now? So some of that historical context is right on 1928 to orient you. The crash was 1929. So we're at this moment of potential joy or expression or partying, freedom for women and all of that. I'll tell you a little bit more. John Sloan is the artist. The title, yours is a much more interesting title. The title is 6th Avenue Elevated Train. just right there. So it is New York, but people thinking, is it Chicago with the elevated trains? Is it Philadelphia with the bell tower? This is certainly of interest to him, and he was interested in capturing, modernity, urban experience, not New York experience. So he's interested in all of those things. Sometimes the specific opens up onto the more universal. One reason that I chose this painting, and I'd like to just tell you that we can do this with abstract work, with sculpture, with contemporary conceptual installation, with Renaissance paintings. It really can open up. One thing about art is that it opens up to a multitude of stories, which is why it's such a key tool for this kind of exploration. But Sloan, in particular, I wanted a painting with a lot of narrative potential. And he was very interested in that. He was a storyteller. He liked to tell stories. He used to go and sketch at the Night Court. He said it was more interesting than any play or tragic comedy that he ever observed. But he wasn't a journalist. He didn't follow up with those people to find out the real story, the real correct answer. Rather, he just liked the idea of almost more like a poet than a journalist, of saying there are all the stories of New York, especially of the working classes, the people who would come into Night Court with petty crimes or public drunkenness, this kind of thing. And he would imagine the rest of the stories. When he paints something like this, he wants you to imagine their stories. So there isn't a right answer in that way. But if I could ask my volunteer group on stage to reflect on what you heard from the others or what you heard from me, and did that change how you see it in any kind of way? Or also reflect on that question of what did I come with that I saw it the way that I saw it? Would you start?
Something that I didn't mention before, but when I had my original interpretation, part of what changed my interpretation was I saw the name John Sloan. And I was like, oh, okay, this is a painting by a man. And again, and I feel like I'm coming across as really gender biased, but like, I think, and then even when you said the name, and what was it about? The elevated train? I was like, of course it's about the train, right? But then when you were talking about how he was taking in different people and telling these stories and those sorts of things, I was even seeing some of the ways that I had my interpretation, then I saw the name, and then I was like, I don't think that that interpretation is probably right. And I wonder, even if I had seen a different name, how that might have impacted if I thought that my perspective was valid, just to think about different aspects of underrepresented groups or different areas of bias or things like that that can come up in terms, and histories, right? And histories about how people make interpretations about stuff.
I shared some information about the artist, but in dialogue with you, I'm going to share a little bit more. He was interested in class, and he was a bit of a socialist activist, and he was interested in observing the working class, of which he was also a part. But he was also very interested in women's rights, and his wife had suffered some mental difficulties, and as part of kind of a therapy for her, he wrote a journal to her where he gave her affirmations daily. And it was meant just to be private between them, but later he published it as a document of women's rights and activists in that time. So just sharing that back with you once you brought up that topic. Does anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. This is associated with your question. It's not directly to your question, but I think it's very interesting that even just cursory introductions or familiarity with the people with whom we're interpreting or with whom we're observing affects the observation. I think that's exactly what you're saying about the name. You know, it's like, oh, it's written by this guy, so of course he's interested in the train. You know, that, and I think we do that. For instance, I didn't mention the church.
Yes.
I never mentioned it, but they all did. And so I think that's because they're alert to the person with whom they're interpreting it. One person in this room had spoken of trauma to me earlier, and so when the car's going to run over that person, I would have never thought that, but because I'd spoken to somebody with trauma in the room, I thought, well, I don't know, maybe that has some validity. That might be accurate. So I think that, to me, that is very instructive.
I mentioned before the phrase intersubjective meaning, but I think you said it much better.
I want to add also to Bob. I think even I would go as far as to say that even all your energy had affected the way I saw the whole picture, the painting. So Bob was a little more calm and stoic, and then like more upbeat. And
You want to just hold up the mic a little more?
Yeah. So I felt like the energy in the room, especially up on stage, the three had affected also the way I saw the photo.
Yeah, I think that's also something that's, just as you were saying, very important to keep in mind.
I just think about, excuse me, when I go to the doctor, the list of questions that it seem to be box checking. And what you have done, the way you have asked your questions, I call them high quality questions. So you ask questions in a way that really allow us to think and really be honest about what we're experiencing. So I think that is my biggest takeaway from right. And it's the quality of the question and doing much more asking than telling to really understand our patients if we're in the medical field.
Thank
I'm
you
also
for sharing
curious
that
about the
observation.
observing versus interpreting piece in terms of what falls into which bucket. So in the things that we are observing, because there might be some things that people determined to be 100% true, right? I think everyone was like, these are women, as opposed to saying this person's wearing this color or this person's doing this or they present in this way. And yeah, I'm curious about that more in terms of how we make sure that we stay in one zone before we get into that other zone, especially since our biases are going to work so hard.
I'm recalling at the very beginning describing that the women were joyous and trying to separate out what is it that you saw that made you think they were joyous. I didn't ask what did you see that made you think they were women, but perhaps I should have. We did have you discussing this painting before with another group. We had a gentleman who said, the couple on the side, which some of you saw as tension, some of you saw as older, some of you saw as representing more stability or tradition in their suit. Another gentleman saw as a gay couple out for a night on the town. And so we really, there's many levels of separating that out. What do you see that makes you say that is one of our questions that we use for parsing and tearing apart the interpretation from the observation. How far along? I mean, I didn't have to rephrase, what did you see that made you think they were women? I should have just said, what do you see that makes you say that? And that would have been more open-ended. Right. I want to sort of wrap up this phrase. I know we have, just on the interest of time, I want to leave some time for question and answer. But Jen, did you want to say anything about self-reflection or engaged curiosity?
What I thought was so beautiful is your point. I know is your point that what you bring into the room really affects what we see, and that's human, and that's part of it. And I also this project that we've just done here, I just want to be really transparent. We have done this with the medical students, but also with so many different groups, with staff, with people who are in our comms department, in our marketing department, research department. So and the other thing is that we've been very lucky to work with the Whitney, but we've also done this with art in our walls. We've done it we've gone to, within our hospitals, there are paintings on the wall, and we used those. So this is very applicable to wherever you work, and within healthcare systems, we're getting a lot of interest from people who are not patient-facing, which I think is really an interesting evolution of this project. And our outcomes, actually, for non-patient-facing groups is almost stronger than some of the patient-facing groups, which is interesting to see. The other thing is that this is all open resourced. We have the benefit of Ellen and educators at the Whitney, but most cities have wonderful museums, and we are really delighted to share this. It is our joy to come and work with different areas to get this curriculum out there and programming. So we would love to hear from you. We have about a minute for questions, if anybody has any.
We have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay.
Please, with the mic, if you would just
I don't want
next
to
to you
be
there.
on top of you.
No, well, let's both. Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I'm a physician. I'm an OBGYN. So I know very well the importance of listening and empathy. And I wonder, what do you think about? I think that when I talk to medical students about empathy and active listening, that is, they come to it very naturally. And I think the process of medical education systematically beats the empathy out of you. And I hear this testimony from many physicians and from patients. And I wonder about the practical kind of, is time or lack of time the enemy of empathy?
So, this system is complicated, there's no doubt, and time is a problem. But it is our belief that empathy actually makes that time better spent with the patient and provides a wellness for our doctors that nothing else does. There's very little I can do to change the fact how much time we get with a patient. I can advocate, I can do that. But I actually think it is a gift that we give our doctors and students, this idea that having empathy for self is an incredibly important skill and actually protects you when things don't go right. So empathy for self is huge. And Jody Halpern is actually one of our colleagues out in California at Berkeley, is really interested in that question. And I will say, hot off the press, when you look at medical students are graded with something called the Jefferson Scale. It's the scale for empathy that is kind of universally used. Most of the time, they start here and they go down. And I was really delighted to see we have quite an extensive empathy curriculum, and our medical students are going back up when they graduate, which is really exciting. Goes to the point that this is teachable. And that's really the question that we're asking right now. What is the best practice to teach it? What is the frequency? And how do we get it out there?
Well, I want to apologize that we didn't have quite as much time
Yeah, we're
for
done.
Q&A as we would have wished. But Jen and I will stick around for a little bit for private questions. And please, I'd love for you all to follow up with us. Jen described all the ways that you can read, or John described all the ways that you could reach them. But please contact us at the Whitney Museum also if you're ever in New York, or if we can share any resources. We are really welcoming and inviting you all to explore further there as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.